Okay, welcome back to members of 121 Community Church in Grapevine, Texas, and our ongoing study in the book of Revelation by the Apostle John. We have reached the exact center of the book of Revelation. We're going to take a look at the Parenthetical Pause Part 2. It's going to be chapter 11, 1 through 6. This is the exact center of the book, and it is an extremely important 6 verses. We're going to take a look at the concept of measuring the temple. We're going to take a look at the concept of the 2 witnesses, and we're going to take a look at the power of the word. But the measuring of the temple has been disputed a lot. Books have been written about what does this mean, the measuring of the temple, and the 2 witnesses has been argued about as well. So it's a critical lesson. So let's begin with block 1. Now in block 1, we'll take a look at verses 1 and 2, and we read, "And there was given to me a reed like a rod. And the angel stood, saying, Measure the temple of God, and the altar, and them that worship, but not the court outside, for it is given to the nations. And this holy city they will tread for 42 months. There are 5 dominant views for measuring the temple. The dispensationalist says it is the literal rebuilt temple that will be restored in the future, prior to the return of Christ. The preterist view says that it is the temple in Jerusalem prior to its destruction in AD 70. The futurist view says it is ethnic Israel. This is a Zionist view, where salvation is secured at the end of history. Now the figurative view has 2 positions. The figurative view basically says that the temple is a community of faith, a community of saints. However, in the first view, it says the outer court is the apostate church that have compromised. The view B says that the community of faith is the temple being measured, but the outer court is spiritual Israel, sealed but still susceptible to harm. We're going to take the figurative view B as our best option. Measuring is to be understood according to Ezekiel 40 through 48, where an angel measures features of the temple. An angel measures with reed the city, the gates, and the wall. This represents security, the security of the city's inhabitants against contamination by false teachers of idolatry. This is God's eschatological community of the saints. Therefore, figuratively, this is speaking of God's future presence, which will dwell forever in the midst of the purified community. We know that God will be present with the eschatological community on earth before the consummation of the eschaton. The Lord will strengthen and uphold their faith. God's presence will be in the midst of the established Christian community. Now, measuring equals God's decree to secure the redemption of the saints. In other words, it is the eschatological temple of Ezekiel, spoken of by John here. In Ezekiel, the inner and the outer courts were secured against Israel's former abominations of worshiping false gods. Christ becomes the interpretive lens for understanding Ezekiel's prophecy for John. Christ is the true temple. The eschatological temple is patterned after the suffering of Christ. In other words, the ecclesia church is the new temple because they are the soma body of the church, where Christ is the kephali head of the community of saints. Next, let's take a look at this 42 months. Symbolically, this represents the period of tribulation in Daniel 7. 3.5 years. It's associated with the Babylonian captivity. It's a time that must pass before the final redemption of the eschaton, of the parousia. And we can reference Israel's wilderness wanderings, which included 42 encampments. And during the wilderness wanderings, what did the Lord do as the pillar of fire? He protected the elect. He protected the children of Israel throughout the wilderness wanderings. So this measuring is a sign of protection for the community of saints. It's a sign of protection. But not only protection, it's protection and empowerment, and it's empowerment so that the church can become a prophetic witness during the tribulation. Take a look at block 2. This is another disputed part in the middle of the book of Revelation. Who are the two witnesses? We read in verse 3, "And they will give power unto my two witnesses, and they shall prophesy 1,260 days in sackcloth." Verses 3 through 6 explain the purpose of the measuring in verses 1 and 2. It's God establishing his end-time presence within the church. The Christian community is to be like prophets, like the prophets Moses and Elijah in the Old Testament. They are to prophetuo, prophesy. That's used in the future indicative active. In the future, during the tribulation, during the final judgment, they will prophesy like Moses and Elijah. Verse 3 is a continuation of verses 1 and 2. It emphasizes the effect of God's presence among his people. Now, if you'll go back to the verb idathe, given up in verse 2, we know that even though God has given up the saints to the Gentiles of Asia Minor and their jurisdiction, he will give the saints the strength to persevere in the midst of this Roman jurisdiction in Asia Minor. He will give them strength to persevere. He has commissioned them here to prophesy spiritual judgment against persecutors. We can actually refer back to Revelation 10:11. The saints are to share in the recommissioning of John. Remember, John is to prophesy again to the peoples, the tongues, and the nations. These are future events. From John's perspective, they apply to what is coming, and what is coming is final judgment. This does apply, however, to the entire church age. The two witnesses, therefore, represent the whole community of faith. Because remember, John the Baptist was not a literal appearance of Elijah. He was the figurative Elijah. Go to Luke 1:17, "And he shall go before him." In other words, John shall go before Christ in the spirit of Elijah. John the Baptist was the spirit of Elijah. It wasn't the reappearance of Elijah in a literal sense. It was John prophesying in the spirit of Elijah. Now, a very important verse here in these 6 verses is verse 4. Very critical verse. Because here is where Christ explains the two witnesses, okay? Verse 4, "These are the 2 olive trees and the 2 lampstands." Remember, lampstands equals church, standing before the Lord of the earth. And it is Kyrios, Lord of the earth. Cross-reference Zechariah 4:10, "The eyes of the Lord run to and fro through the whole earth." Standing before the Lord represents an eternal, secure relationship. The lampstands in the tabernacle were in the presence of God, and their light represented God's presence. If you take a look at Zechariah 4:6, this is the word of the Lord. The lampstands and the olive oil that feeds the lampstands equal the word of the Lord that fills and radiates from the witnesses. I'll read that again. The lampstands and the olive oil that feeds the lampstands equal the word of the Lord that fills and then radiates from the witnesses. Therefore, the spiritual temple of the saints is to draw its power from the Spirit, represented as olive oil here. The community of believers can be attacked by the beast, but not fatally. Revelation 11:7-12 tells us that. Remember, in chapters 1 and 2, lampstands refers to the church. So we're going to interpret the two witnesses as the church that is empowered by olive trees, empowered by olive oil, which equals Holy Spirit. It's going to be spiritually empowered prophetic witnesses in the church. So from here, let's take a look at block 3. We have taken up the figurative view of measuring as the promise of the Lord's eschatological presence within the midst of the community. We've taken up the figurative interpretation of the two witnesses as the oil-fed lampstands which equals the church. Christ already told us this in the Revelation, at the beginning of the Revelation. The lampstands are the church. Now we're going to look at verses 5 and 6, the power of the word. In verse 5, and if any man will hurt them, fire proceeds out of their mouth and devours their enemies. If any man hurts them, he must be killed in the same manner. The lampstands are now portrayed as invincible. They cannot be harmed in any ultimate eternal sense. They will carry out their spiritual mission. The truth of prophetic witness will set in motion the final judgment. Take a look at John 12:48. I love this verse. Christ is speaking. He that rejects me has one that judges him, the word that I have spoken. Fire from their mouths equals a sign for their pronouncement of final judgment. Remember, Christ judges his enemies by a sword proceeding from his mouth. Remember, we had that in an earlier lesson. Sword equals pronouncement of judgment. This verse refers back to Revelation 2:16. Repent, or I will come quickly, and I will fight with the sword in my mouth. Also in the Apocrypha for Ezra 13:26, this is he who the Most High has been keeping for many ages, who will himself deliver the creation and direct those who are left. Also Isaiah 11:4, he shall smite the earth with the rod of his mouth. And then Deuteronomy 19, we take a look at how these persecutors will be punished, do unto him that which he would have done unto his brother, where punishment is patterned after the intended crime. So it's critical to understand here that the members, the saints, the community of saints are going to be prophetically empowered. In the latter days, in the end times, there's going to be prophetic power present from the church. It's going to be a powerful presence in the same way as Moses and Elijah. And it's really going to become clear if you take a look at this next verse. In verse 6, it describes this power. They have the power to shut heaven, so it will not rain for days during their prophecy. They have the power over the waters to turn them to blood, and to smite the earth with plagues at their will. The shutting up of heaven is a sign of heavenly intervention. People have violated God's covenant. It is a judgment because of idolatry. Let's take a look at Kings 17:1. We read that Elijah says there will be no rain except according to his word. And then Leviticus 26:1, a very important one. You shall make no idols, for I am the Lord your God. This 3.5-year ministry of affliction and judgment by the witnesses corresponds to Elijah's ministry of judgment. Take a look at James 5:17. Elijah prayed that it might not rain, and it did not rain for 3.5 years. And then in the Apocrypha, Sirach 48:1. Listen to the way that Elijah is described. Then the prophet Elijah arose like fire. The word burned like a torch. We could say the word burned like a lampstand. The church's prophetic witness stands before God's presence like the prophets of old in the end time. This is, I can't underline how important these 6 verses are. This is the absolute center of the book of Revelation. These 6 verses, entire books have been written about these 6 verses. What is the measuring of the temple? What is the identity of the 2 witnesses? And just about everyone says that the 2 witnesses are Elijah and Moses, but we have to understand it as prophecy in the spirit of Elijah, not the literal Elijah coming back, but prophecy in the spirit of Elijah. That's the way we've got to interpret it, just like John the Baptist prophesied in the spirit of Elijah. Now the church is going to prophesy in the spirit of Elijah. What was his ministry? It was a ministry of judgment. We could subtitle this entire lesson, The Spirit of Elijah. The church in the spirit of Elijah. There you go. There's a subtitle. The church in the spirit of Elijah. It is Parenthetical-Pause Part 2. We have not reached 11:15 yet when we reach the 7th trumpet. So there will be a Parenthetical-Pause Part 3. We will pick up in 11 verse 7 for that next parenthetical pause. That'll wrap up this lesson from 11:1 through 6.